If you've ever wanted to make faraway mountains look epic, or capture wildlife like you're on a safari, or just compress the heck out of a background, this lens is the ticket. Today we're diving into how to shoot with the 100 to 400 millimeter. The 100 to 400 doesn't have a long-term place in my bag because I'm usually looking for gear that's either more lightweight and versatile or faster in low light conditions. But this baby is pretty fun, and I'm going to talk about why. I'll talk through why you might want this lens in your kit, some tips for shooting with it, as well as some gear recommendations to help you decide which version to get to balance aperture, weight, and your budget. I'm Brenda Bergerine, a professional photographer and videographer here with practical photography tips to help you learn, create, and elevate. Hit subscribe and let's get learning about the 100 to 400 millimeter lens. You might notice that I'm holding a Canon camera, the Canon R5 Mark II, and if you've watched any of my videos, you know that Mark and I are Sony shooters, so now you're wondering what's this all about. Be sure you subscribe and stay tuned because we're putting together a fun video on what happens when Sony shooters try Canon. But first up, let's talk about why the 100 to 400 millimeter focal length. The sweet spot of reach and flexibility. The 100 to 400 is kind of a secret weapon. It gives you an insane reach without being too massive. It's great for adventure photographers, wildlife shooters, and honestly, anyone who wants to isolate their subject or compress space dramatically. The 100 to 400 focal length also allows for a lot of creative possibilities. I love the compression magic that occurs, which means the background appears closer to the subject. It also allows for a shallow depth of field at the longer focal lengths, even at the higher apertures. This lens is great for capturing details from far away when you can't get close, like candid moments or sports, landscapes, wildlife. Sure, it's bigger than your 24 to 70, but it's still light enough to hand hold, hike with, or throw in a travel kit if you pack smart. Let's move on to comparing this lens to some other options you might be considering. What are some alternatives to the 100 to 400? The telephoto lens I typically carry is the 70 to 200 millimeter. The 70 to 200 is more versatile in tighter, everyday situations, whereas the 100 to 400 shines when you need that extra reach. Another trade-off to be aware of is that the 100 to 400 millimeter often has a variable aperture, for example, 4.5 to 5.6, whereas 70 to 200 might have, for example, a constant f2.8. So if low light is important to you, that will matter. As I mentioned, you can still get bokeh with those higher apertures at 400 millimeters, but if you're worried about shooting in low light, that might be a consideration. Another potential alternative is a prime telephoto lens, like a 300 millimeter or a 400 millimeter. Prime lenses are faster and sharper, but in this case would be heavier and less flexible. A prime lens seems to make less sense to me for telephoto focal lengths unless you have a very specific and predictable subject. The 100 to 400 gives you versatility for more dynamic environments. Now, it's hard to compare the 100 to 400 to standard zooms like the 24 to 70 or the 24 to 105, but I'll do it anyway. You'll want something like the 24 to 70 if you're doing any close range work, but the 100 to 400 is a great option if you're in big outdoor spaces or shooting from a distance. For example, you might use your 24 to 70 for environmental storytelling, but then switch to the 100 to 400 when you want to zoom in and really highlight a climber on a distant ridge or a deer across the meadow. Let's dive into some tips for shooting with the 100 to 400. So first up, shutter speed is going to be key. Because you're zoomed in, even the small movements are exaggerated, making motion blur a potential problem. You'll definitely want to use faster shutter speeds such as 1/500 and up for handheld shots. And if your subject is moving, shoot even faster at 1/1000 or hopefully more. Second, you'll want to use image stabilization when shooting handheld. You can turn it off if you're on a tripod for those sharper results. Third, you can shoot wide open at f5.6 for a dreamy background blur, or at a higher aperture for more detail in landscapes or layered scenes. So remember, at 400, you'll get some background blur even at mid-range apertures like f8. Pick your aperture accordingly. Number 4, you'll want to make sure you're paying attention to the background. Since compression pulls the background into the scene, make sure that what's behind your subject adds to the story. Better yet, make compression part of your composition rather than just an afterthought. Make it part of your plan. This is great for mountain ranges, cities, textures. I'll grab a telephoto lens when I want to compress a mountain in my background. So speaking of composition, you'll want to explore various techniques with this lens. How does it feel to compress your subject against a background and fill the frame versus showing more of the surroundings for some environmental storytelling? Try both layering and isolating subjects, and don't forget to use foreground, even when you're shooting at long focal lengths. Number 6, zoom to experiment with different compositions between the 100 and 400. That difference is so dramatic, but also remember that we usually tell you to be intentional about what focal length you're choosing to shoot at, and then zoom with your feet. With these telephoto focal lengths, you'll need to invest in some running shoes in order to zoom with your feet. So go to the running store and actually try them on first, because I recently learned that the hard way. But to my point, you might want to watch my video on how to pick the right focal length for your needs. Let's talk next about when to use the 100 to 400. This is a great lens, as I said, for wildlife, since it lets you shoot from a safe distance, so you're not disturbing your subject or getting chased by an elk and ending up in a viral social media video. It's a fun lens to try out for those adventure and lifestyle shots when your subject is far away. Think hikers, skiers, surfers off in the distance. And due to that compression, the 100 to 400 can add drama to the landscapes when you pair people with the background for scale references. And while it might not be my first pick, I could see this being a fun lens for travel, depending on your style. You can zoom in on details from across a river, canyon, or street. In your landscapes, the 100 to 400 could help you isolate interesting textures, focus on light pockets or compressed peaks. And it can also add some focal length variety to your landscape portfolio if you tend to shoot all your landscapes wide. And lastly, you might use this lens for capturing candid portraits from a distance, whether that's at an event or out in nature. Telephoto candids allow you to capture moments without interrupting, but it will look different than the intimate impact from a wide angle candid. Make sure you watch my video on 35mm portrait photography to see what I'm talking about there. Finally, let's talk about some lens recommendations. This is the Canon RF 100 to 400mm f5.6 to f8. It's light, budget friendly for RF users. This is probably the best for hobbyists or travel shooters. If you compare it to my 70 to 200, it's pretty compact. If you're a Canon shooter and you're looking for something more pro, you might look at the Canon EF 100 to 400 f4.5 to 5.6. It's the classic pro option, sharp, fast autofocus, great stabilization. It pairs well with RF cameras via an adapter. If you're a Sony shooter, you'll be looking at the Sony FE 100 to 400mm f4.5 to 5.6 G Master. It's super sharp, great autofocus, one of the best in the class. If you're a Nikon shooter, you'll look at the Nikon Z 100 to 400 f5.4 to 5.6. This is lightweight for a Z series telephoto lens. It has amazing sharpness and stabilization. And if you're looking for a budget-friendly option, I would go with the Sigma 100 to 400 f5 to 6.3. It has decent optics, and it's a good way to try this range before investing in the top tier glass. And so as you know, I get all my gear recommendations from Mark. If you want him to review any of these lenses or any other lenses, make sure to drop a comment below and he'll get right to that. If you've got a 100 to 400 or you're thinking of picking one up, get out there and stretch it to its full potential. Shoot something far away, isolate your subject, and see what kind of drama you can add to your photos with a little compression magic. Let me know in the comments what you love to shoot at 400mm, or if you're still deciding which telephoto lens is right for you. And next, check out my video on the sharpest lenses you can buy. I'll see you over there.